Good morning, friends. As Jesus begins his answer to the disciples' questions in Matthew 24, he says, "See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of war. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains." Now, obviously, our Lord continues, but this portion will be enough to focus us today because we've been talking about our Lord's concern that his followers not be led astray. He wants his disciples to know the truth of what is going to happen. Why? Because when things start happening, it would otherwise be very easy to be deceived by people who will give a false reason for why they are happening. And clearly our Lord says when all these things happen, that is not indicative of the end. The end is not yet, he says. And these are but the beginning of the birth pains, he says. And the only reason Jesus would make these clarifications that it's not the end when you see these things is because that will be the natural assumption. And that will be what false teachers and false messiahs will pick up on. You see all of these incredible, devastating things happening, it must be the end, and they can use that to deceive people. And unfortunately, in our own experiences, we have not experienced the end, but we have experienced or at least observed and witnessed such deceptions happening. Even in the last several decades, I'm 42, within my own living memory, there have been so many people claiming to be Christians. I am not the personal judge as to who is and who isn't, but people that seem a little bit out there. They seem to kind of fit that category to me, at least, without knowing all the details. But people who say that they see the signs, they see the things Jesus is talking about in the Olivet Discourse, and they see other things, whatever. And so they get on the radio or they get on TV and they say the end is upon us, and they give a date as to when the world is going to end. And I know it may seem hard to believe this, but there have been so many people led astray and deceived by such claims, even in our modern American world. And people have quit their jobs, given away their life savings, done all manner of things that they never would have had they not been deceived about the end being upon us. And then that date rolls around and nothing happens, and their lives are left in shambles because they were deceived. But the deceivers, the false teachers, they got what they wanted in terms of money, book deals, acclaim, whatever it might have been. And so that's a very modern day experience, but it kind of shows that Jesus is concerned that his people not be deceived. And he's also concerned that his people not be distressed, even as they see things happening that he does talk about. I mean, he says you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, and yet he immediately says, "See that you are not alarmed," because that is an otherwise very alarming statement, isn't it? That you're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars, that wars are going to happen, and you might even find yourself in the middle of one. Because even for those of us, in America today, the vast majority of us, or at least certainly the majority of us alive today in America, have never witnessed the horrors of war firsthand. We do have some understanding, however, that war is a horribly tragic and just horrifying thing, because lives are not only taken away, but even the people who go on living afterward sometimes do as shattered human beings. Their bodies are broken, minds altered, futures bleak, and that's not even just talking about the actual combatants. Entire nations devastated, communities decimated, families left in pieces, and that trauma hits everyone. And there are, of course, far more things than just war that give trauma. But can we think of any singular concept that more fully brings to mind horror and travesty and pain other than war itself? And yet Jesus says, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed. How in the world can we do that? How can we think of this greatest source of horror and pain, war? How can we consider that happening and not be alarmed? I mean, again, faced with the prospect of life-shattering, nation-ending, mind-altering war, how can we not be alarmed? Well, because as Jesus says, for this must take place. War is war. War is terrible. But we do not need to be alarmed. We do not need to actually be terrified of the terror of war, because among the other signs that Jesus describes, war is simply something that must take place. And let's think about that statement for a moment. Now, I think probably one of the first thoughts, I've just told you to think about it, probably one of the first thoughts you have is a question of, well, why must war take place? And that, of course, is a good question and a big question, and it's unfortunately it's outside the scope of what we can handle today in the devotion today, though we'll answer it in a sort of a general way. But for now, as we think about this statement here, let's consider its clear implication. Jesus saying, this must take place, or these things must take place. If that is so, and Jesus said it, so it is so, it's true, well, then that requires that there be a purpose for these things taking place. And if there's a purpose, then there's a purpose giver. There's a person behind the purpose who is orchestrating all things. Because a huge part of the horror of war, not the only part, but a huge part, is the loss of control, the seeming chaos of war. This is one reason why there's a term called the fog of war, because in the midst of all that happens in war, you can't really tell what is happening. It's so chaotic, and you can't see everything. You can't figure out how it all puts together. And human beings, as a general rule, don't like that. We like to be in control. We like to have the information. We like to know how the pieces fit together and why. And so a big part of the alarm that goes along with the idea of wars, and perhaps even especially the rumors of wars, is that uncertainty factor. What is going to happen? Will war break out? Will it be delayed? If so, for how long? And everyone is on pins and needles, even before a shot is fired, even before a single soldier gets up. The stress is already almost overwhelming because we just don't know. And not knowing adds so much extra distress and alarm to the whole situation. But Jesus says, not just about wars and rumors of war, but about all the signs that he describes, he says, do not be alarmed, for all these things must happen. And the knowledge that these things must happen is part of what helps us to not be alarmed. Because once again, if God is saying, and remember, yes, Jesus is God, if God is saying these things must happen, then that is a reminder that God is the one orchestrating all these things, that he is using them for a purpose. He has a specific end in mind, and that puts us squarely into a mindset of resting in God's sovereignty, that he is in control, and nothing will happen that won't serve his purpose, and his purpose is good. Therefore, no matter what happens, even if those events genuinely are traumatic in an earthly sense, we still don't have to be alarmed by them happening. Because no, these things aren't happening because the wheels have come off and things have spun out of control. No. Rather, these things are happening because God is in control, and for his own reasons and according to his own perfect purposes, he says they must happen. And so if you look at this world and you see the kinds of things happening that Jesus talks about in the Olivet Discourse, and I have already taught and preached that, yes, we do see these things happening, but a big part of not being led astray is not being alarmed by these things, because we know they have to happen. Now, that does not mean that we, in our not being alarmed, it doesn't mean that we become apathetic to them. It doesn't mean we don't care about them, or we don't care if people are suffering in wars, or suffering due to famines or earthquakes, or that families are split because love grows cold when some reject the gospel in other situations. Not at all. We should use these as opportunities to serve broken and hurting people with the truth and love of Christ. And so it doesn't mean we separate ourselves. We don't become aloof. It doesn't mean we just shut down and we don't respond in any emotional way. But it does mean that we ought not be alarmed. We ought not fear because we see these things happening. Because Jesus himself said they must happen. And we know that that's because God is sovereign. And he's going to use every last part of these things to bring about his purposes. So understand that they will happen. Understand that they must happen. And let that knowledge direct you not to alarm or fear, but to a deep and abiding confidence and even peace in the knowledge that God is sovereign over all, and he will bring about his good and pleasing and perfect will in and through all that he ordains. With that, I pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I'll see you Sunday.